Did you know that Dead Space was originally conceptualized as a sequel to System Shock? In 2005, the idea of creating a second sequel to System Shock, one of the founding fathers of the immersive sim genre, was presented to EA executives. Unfortunately for System Shock fans like me, the success of Resident Evil 4 caused EA to reconsider this idea, and it was reformed into the legendary sci-fi horror game that eventually became Dead Space. But what if that never happened? What if we had gotten a sequel to System Shock that had the oppressive atmosphere and dismemberment mechanics of Dead Space, combined with the emergent gameplay systems that the System Shock games are so well known for? This was the idea that I had in my brain when I started development roughly 2 years ago. I'm proud to say that after 1 year of full-time development on this project, Void Flesh is finally available as a free demo on Steam right now, so if that concept sounds interesting to you, or you like what you see in this devlog, maybe give it a try, and let me know what you think in the comments. Side note, if you're interested in the journey I took to get to this concept and the multiple failed prototypes to get there, I have a video coming out in the future about that too. I was going to include it in this devlog, but it got a little bit too long, so I'm just going to make it into its own video instead. I started out by creating a new Unreal Engine project and then porting over the object carrying mechanics from an old stealth game that I had laying around that I had made for a 2-week game jam. If you're curious if you can make a stealth game with immersive sim elements in under 2 weeks, the answer is absolutely not. I then implemented a basic enemy AI with sight and hearing using some models and animations from a previous prototype that I had abandoned. I modeled and textured a wrench and implemented some basic melee combat to test whether the health component that I wrote was working correctly. With the fundamentals of the gameplay somewhat completed, it was time to get into the nitty-gritty, the dismemberment system. In previous versions of the game, I had set it up manually, and when I say manually, I mean that I had set up code for literally each individual limb and each enemy to choose where they would get cut off, what would happen when they got cut off, what behaviors would happen. In this version of the game, I made a dismemberment component that handles all of that automatically for me. All I have to do is put in the name of a bone for it to check whether it's been hit or not, give it a health value, and then select a static mesh for it to spawn as a gib when that limb is cut off. When I was implementing the gibs for the enemy limbs, I accidentally based them off of the physics object class I had written, which unintentionally made it so that the character could pick them up and throw them at enemies and deal massive damage, which I eventually nerfed, but I left it in the game because I think it's hilarious. I then implemented a simple explosive barrel to test the dismemberment and gibbing systems. They worked. Finally, I modeled some basic modular assets that were inspired by Dead Space and Doom 2016 using an old trim sheet from the last prototype of the game so that I could test out what the aesthetic of the game and the level I was working on might actually end up looking like. And that's it, that's all I did when I very first prototyped Void Flesh. It felt a little bit weird to play, as most early prototypes for games do, and it didn't really have any content, but playing it felt immediately kind of fun and engaging compared to older versions that were just kind of boring. I was enjoying creating different setups for how to kill the enemy that I had put in the level, and the aesthetic just felt right. I knew I was onto something with the concept at this point, and I decided to continue working on it. I started the second stage of prototyping by re-implementing the inventory system from the last prototype of the game I worked on, along with a few basic items like coins, health items, stamina refills, and whatnot. I opted not to go with a grid-based inventory system because I just don't find inventory Tetris fun. Only 9 slots are in the inventory system to force the player to make potentially difficult decisions with their items instead of just being able to hoard everything permanently. I also re-implemented text logs from the same old prototype, except instead of only being able to be read at the location they were placed, now you can read them at a later time for convenience. I would have preferred doing audio logs, but I just don't have enough budget, and I think text logs are more immersive than bad audio logs with my terrible voice acting. Next, I created the first version of the nail gun, which you've been seeing in some of the B-roll footage already. It worked pretty similar to a generic starter pistol. It had a really fast fire rate compared to other weapons that I plan to implement in the future. At this point, I also decided stealth gameplay should be somewhat more interesting, so I implemented assassinations, which just gives an enemy basically insta-killing it whenever you hit them in the back with a melee. It actually gives you a reward for being stealthy instead of just being able to avoid the enemy. I also wrote the first implementation for the oil system, which was very bad. It constantly spread to items it wasn't supposed to and caused a whole world of issues, but it at least created some interesting scenarios. I created the recycler and junk items, along with a vending machine system so that I could give the player a reason to backtrack to certain areas to recycle items for coins to create new inventory spaces, and a vending machine to buy items to help them if they run out of heals that they found in the environment. I realized quickly that the enemies didn't have any actual reward for killing them. It was just easier to sneak past them pretty much all the time. There was no reason to waste your resources. So I made enemies drop junk items when they're killed to create a combat loop where playing aggressively will reward you with the supplies to continue to play aggressively. At this point I decided I probably had enough gameplay mechanics to take a crack at making my first level for the game, so that's what I did next. I started by coming up with 4 different areas that I wanted to make for the level. The lobby, which is where you would start, security, storage, and then finally, the biggest area in the entire original level, hardware labs. The player would start in the lobby, where they would be taught to pick up objects and move them around, unlock doors, and read text logs. They would then make their way to security, where they would see their first enemy and either fight or sneak past them after picking up the wrench in the hallway leading up to it. They would then be directed to a room where they would be given the code for hardware labs, where they would then go and experience what was easily the best part of the demo. Originally, I wanted the game to be a completely seamless experience the same way that Dead Space 2 was, but I had issues with physics objects that were carried between levels causing bugs, and players were generally unsure during playtesting how far the objective was actually allowed to be. No one could really tell whether this area was off limits for where they were supposed to go. It was just too confusing. There were a couple things that were fairly consistent between everybody. Hardware Labs was the best level, easily. It was a bit larger than the other levels and way more vertical, and the objectives being much more self-contained within the level resonated with people a lot more. I also realized that the industrial aesthetic with the really dark shadows was just making it kind of hard to navigate and recognize certain areas. It all looked way too similar. After the playtest, I decided it was probably for the best to start a new level from scratch. It would be only one level, it would be roughly double the size of the Hardware Labs level, and it would be brighter with more readable lighting. I was going to make it with a hub and spoke level design, and I was going to use the verticality and the self-contained aspects of Hardware Labs as a basis. I started off by making the hub of the level, using the new aesthetic and lighting that I had developed. I used fully dynamic lighting this time around, and an ambient cube map to illuminate the shadows in a very flat way. I think this is pretty similar to what the System Shock remake uses, just by looking at it, but I can't be entirely sure. I then expanded off of the hub with 4 different areas. The foyer, which is where the player starts and is the only save room in the entire level. Security. Testing, which is 2 floors, very claustrophobic, and the final objective location, and the simulation lab, which is 2 floors and also 2 rooms, and it's also pretty claustrophobic. I decided it was probably not good to just spawn the player directly in the foyer, so I created a hallway with a 90-degree turn where I would start the player. It's a massive reveal from this super cramped tight space into this large vertical room. In an older version of the game, I had these nests that you would run into as you went through the level that would spawn in enemies and lock you into a room for a certain amount of waves, kind of like the gore nests from Doom 2016. I decided to recycle that idea, but I made the combat nest the entire level. The objective was to get to it and destroy it while it constantly spawns in enemies. I created a simple zone system where I can place boxes around the level that have certain enemies and certain spawn points to find where enemies can be spawned in, and also to check whether or not they can spawn in at all, so that they don't spawn in if they're in the same room as the player, because that would be really weird looking. This kept map traversal much more interesting, because now you're always on the back foot. You're never safe in any given area for a long period of time. Backtracking is risky and dangerous, and you're not guaranteed to be alone in any given space that you're in. Midway through designing this level, I made a absolutely terrible decision, and that was that the level wasn't scary enough. It didn't look dark enough. And so I completely rubber banded on the aesthetic midway through the art process and relit the entire level with baked lighting to be much darker. And this turned out about as well as you could expect, but I'll get to that later. I also added a new weapon called the flash grenade to add more depth to the stealth system. You can use it to blind enemies to make pathing easier through a specific area, or you can use it to blind an enemy and make a quick escape before they can chase you down. I also made some massive balancing changes to the nail gun. In the first playtest, people were spamming it a lot. It didn't feel methodical enough. There was no decision, it was just shooting until the enemy died despite the dismemberment system. So I implemented a 1.5 times damage multiplier on the limbs to make it more ammo efficient to shoot them, and I halved the magazine size of the nail gun from 8 to 4, and I also cut the fire rate in half so it was much slower. After working on the map for roughly a month or two and making some balancing changes like I mentioned above, I built the game again and sent it out for playtesting for the second time. The results were generally very positive, especially with the nail gun. I noticed the gameplay was much closer to the vision that I had, but the decision that I made to try and bring back the darker aesthetic caused the issues with navigating the level to resurface, and players could once again no longer tell which area they were in at a first glance, and I decided it was probably for the best that I started the lighting over again and went much brighter, but this time with a bit more of a compromise. I relit the entire level again, this time using the same strategy I originally started with dynamic lighting and an ambient cube map that was just a flat color to illuminate the shadows, but this time I had a bit more of a focus on creating a moody atmosphere over something that felt real. I came up with the simple concept that living and working areas would be lit with warm lighting, and industrial or transitional areas such as the hub would be lit with cold lighting. I also revised the painted material that I was using for the walls to look much more worn, and I created a detailed trim sheet that I used to add screws and other details to all the modular assets to make them look less flat. I also completely revised certain rooms that I didn't feel like had the correct response from players. I completely refurbished the simulation lab office space, which before was just a bunch of computers, and is now a bunch of computers with glass in between them and a table, as well as more verticality, including an underground passage that you can use to sneak past the enemy inside. And I also renamed it to Research and Development because it was a much more fitting title. I completely redesigned the bottom floor of the testing chamber. It was way too claustrophobic and made setting up enemy pathing extremely difficult and unfair. It has now massively been expanded. And one of the most important aspects gameplay-wise, I finally made it so that the glass was breakable. I had completely forgotten to do this throughout the rest of development, and once I realized how much people were trying to break glass to skip areas and go through interesting paths, I realized that it was something that I should absolutely have done earlier. After taking a lot longer to nail down the aesthetic than I would have liked, I sent the game out for playtesting again, and the results were significantly better. The redesigns to certain areas made gameplay much more interesting and fair, and the relight significantly helped players develop a better mental map. For the first time, players weren't getting hopelessly lost after completing the first objective or two. One thing I did notice, though, that was fairly negative was that because there was only one enemy in the game at the time, which was the basic melee grunt, the game's difficulty curve after you got the nail cannon plummeted significantly, and the ending of the level was completely anticlimactic because there was no possible way at the time for me to set up a difficult encounter in the same room that was supposed to have an early game encounter in it when you first go into it. So I decided to completely revisit the encounter design and create a new enemy called the Puker. It's a ranged version of the base grunt enemy that shoots a few slow-moving projectiles before it repositions to find a new angle on the player and repeats the same thing again until you run away or kill it. It's designed to give you a challenge with the nail gun rather than you being able to use the nail gun to completely negate any damage that you would take because all of the enemies are slow and melee based. Encounters that have a Puker in them at range now make the base grunts more threatening because you have to make sure you keep your distance while dealing with the Puker or avoid the projectiles while you deal with the base grunts. It's much more dynamic. I also did a bit of a hack to set up a custom encounter in testing after you pick up the level 1 security card. It's the most enemies in a single encounter in the entire level at 4, and I made it specifically to try and test your skill and usage of tools or the surrounding environment, which as the finale of the game I think it very much should. I finally sent the game off for what I presumed was going to be the final playtest. It was the last playtest I was going to do where I was actually looking for advice on what I can improve in the game mechanically, as there was not much in the last playtest that I could change. It went extremely positive and pretty much everyone had a good experience, and with that I had completed the demo for Voidflesh after almost a year of work. Outside of some minor bug fixes, the game was finally in a state that I had been trying to get it to for nearly an entire year and had dreamed of 2 entire years ago. I could finally pick it up and play it myself and not pick apart every little detail like the perfectionist that I usually am, and I could actually have a fun time playing it. If you like what you see, the demo is actually available right now on Steam, like I said earlier in the video, so if you want to try it, go ahead and let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching.